All right.
So this is a moment in which I thought I was starting a new project with this car, a green 328i.
So this is my new project. Let's focus over here.
And as it turned out,
Focus
it
back
wasn't because of this falling through the battery tray and numerous other places. So fortunately, that car did have this. And then when I found this,
oh my gosh.
What's on the front? Paint?
Vinyl.
the project had to change, and I hope you can understand after our small transformation last episode. So it did have this, but remember, this car, now in this form, does also have a manual transmission. So as it turns out, this is all we wanted. So here are my helpers for this project and a couple other bits on the M3, Danny, Marty, and Lucy. Great moral support. One's a great mechanic as well. He more or less did everything while I assisted. His hands did all the work here, and I shot it to document it. And so yeah, it was time to pull this transmission out. Fortunately, this car was about $1,600, and this transmission itself can clock up to $1,000 used. That in itself ended up being a great investment. And before people get too upset, things like the front sway bar were totally ripped off. All the jacking points had become rusty holes, and everything about this car was just scary to delve into. So we got the transmission out. I sold the car as a whole without even cracking the hydraulic system or brakes, and someone else is gonna do what they can to bring it back to life. Simple as that. Transmission out of the car, needing to obviously be cleaned up and get a little bit of a turtle wax treatment, but ready to roll.
Mo put a stereo in his G-Wagon in slightly more time than it took Danny and I to remove a transmission on E36. That's how we do it. Alright, so I just had the AC system emptied by a shop for the E36 M3 just so I can work on taking the engine out. I'm about to go over some bumps here, you can maybe hear and feel maybe how nasty the suspension feels. So this tentatively will be, well, it is for sure. I'm driving home right now to take the rear subframe out. So I'm on the final drive as is for this 284,000 mile automatic E36 M3. That door card's off right now. I haven't driven this thing in a couple months because I had PDR done. So the door card's taken off. Saggy glove box, tears in seats, gross steering wheel. So aside also from this just being an automatic, this transmission, assumed original at 284,000 miles, slips really bad. If you give it too much gas too soon, the revs will jump up, but the transmission is not really holding on at that point. It will slam into gear. The engine at idle, its pulley system makes weird, kind of iffy noises. The head is leaking, assuming at the head gasket back onto the headers. So after I've driven it, get some heat into the exhaust and pressure into the cooling system, that fluid will leak out right onto the hot exhaust, and steam will come out of the hood, and it looks like the car is on fire. This is time enough for refreshment, so let's take care of it all and give this thing a new lease of life the fun way. So yeah, I'm excited. March, it's starting. We almost started last year, middle of summer, and now we're finally doing it, so I'm excited.
So after my final automatic hot rod moment, it was time to park the car in the garage in the position it would get lifted up on jack stands. And it was necessary to take a moment to appreciate the look of the car and everything I had gone through again in that first episode. But like previously stated, there were a lot of things under the skin that needed taken care of, and now was finally that time. So again, first thing was up on the jack stands and taking a look at what we had to deal with. Unfortunately, this car being a 284,000 mile car was surprisingly clean underneath. And what surprisingly clean underneath often translates into is a lack of difficulty in removing nuts and bolts. For instance, the exhaust manifold. I know because we just did it on the green car. We broke every stud on the exhaust of that green car. On this M3, we didn't break any. They all came off super easily. And whether that is because it's been worked on before, as this car did have 2 previous rear end accidents that didn't affect much, that could be the case. Maybe things had been worked on before or replaced before, especially with the rear subframe, if there was just enough of the rear end damage in these previous accidents, though history and reports suggest that it wasn't. So with everything being so clean and easy to work on, things flowed pretty quickly. And ironically, I went inside for a glass of water or coffee, I think at one point, right before we were ready to take out the subframe. I guess we were so close to it and it was so easy that I came back out and didn't even get to shoot Danny dropping the subframe. It was suddenly just out and that was that. So after a number of items were removed, I think it's just a series of about 4 or so big bolts to get it out of the car. And yeah, then we were able to assess the condition that things were in. Really, really dusty, minor surface rust here and there, but overall, again, a very clean rear subframe for a very high mileage car, even in Utah. So after getting some time to assess the needs in the subframe and bushings and bearings that we're going to have to pull out before powder coating, axles to rebuild, differential clutches to replace, the next thing on the list, though, was one that you might have seen a little bit of a teaser in the end of the previous episode, but you're seeing now, tearing apart the front end to remove the S52 from the M3. So in deciding I was going to do a head gasket and wanting to replace some of the things like bearings and whatnot in the bottom of the engine, I decided it's easy enough to pull this engine, and it would be a lot easier at that point to do things like removing the automatic transmission, installing the future manual transmission, and just having space to work on this engine all around the car. At this moment, I didn't know how deep I was going to go. We were just going to have to look once we cracked it open, but we put a load leveler on the hoist. Deb, my girlfriend, helped keep the engine pushed over at one point until we finally realized there were a couple electrical connectors still hung on. Finally, this moment was a cool one. This is the first engine I've ever pulled out of a car, and of all things, an S52 for an M3. I'm definitely a little bit behind the curve on S52 things, but it was cool to kind of fulfill that in my BMW history. So thumbs up for good teamwork and getting that engine out. Good timing too. So first up a couple days later was removing automatic transmission things. Lines from the transmission cooler, the oil cooler for the transmission. Next up, simply just unbolting and pulling this thing off, realizing that there's a bunch of transmission fluid that's going to leak out from the torque converter, and then getting the flywheel off and so on and so forth. So simple as that. Suddenly this was the last time this engine would have an automatic transmission bolted to it. Also exciting again, I mean, I've alluded to it, but to see the VIN on the back of the head of this engine was the VIN of the car, and it is original to the car, so cool spec there. So one thing some of you might have expected from that green parts car also was pulling the pedals. And although I did, I soon after found out that you can actually build a manual setup from automatic pedals. The difference is the brake pedal is skinnier to accommodate more space for the third clutch pedal, but the peg on the bracket is actually there. And I ended up stealing that brake pedal and then the switches from it, but we'll get into all that later. All right, so we're back to rear subframe things, and what we're doing here is melting the bushings out of their sockets, if you will. These bushings have a little thin rubber sleeve around the outside of them. It's not metal on metal in this case. So if you heat them up and start them on fire, you'll see them start to bubble, and you can actually hammer them out. You just have to brush the metal a little bit after that to make sure it doesn't get too gooey and gross inside. Here's also a snap ring. It took me 40 tries to get out.
Here's your workout for the day. We got 5 minutes of e-brake wiggling with the channel lock, then by hand. There she comes. 5 minutes each side. Minor violence, not too bad. There it is. Nice. This took me like 50 tries yesterday. Now that I turned the camera on, I got it in 1 try on this side. That's pretty incredible. Probably the rustiest part of the underside are these dust covers, mainly the backside. Heat shields, dust covers, whatever they are. it is. Something's happening. Piece of cake. Again, not so sure about what I'm seeing with this outer sleeve. Where there was once a bushing, there's still a metal sleeve I need to get out of there. You can see the tool I'm pointing with is a hacksaw. Can't remember. We'll see how well this goes. We'll see how well this stays in focus. I'm just gonna try to cut through this sleeve and see if I can pop it out that way. Okay, here we go. So far, so good. It's gotta be so close. There you have it.
Back to narration. So we have a tool set up here for removing the front suspension. So it's everything from shocks and springs to brakes and bearings and the steering rack and so forth. So all of this really was just because I will be switching to different suspensions. So I'll have to swap that out regardless, but also to powder coat things like the heat shield, this front subframe, which I'll also be reinforcing, and also cleaning up this rear sway bar, which both Sams are taking off here, but left Sam forgot to catch it and almost hit right Sam in the face. So you can see general condition here, not bad at all. The heat shields, again, were the things that had the most corrosion, but if anything, this is just a comparison for future, what the parts looked like before. So these knuckles actually won't really have anything done to them, but yeah, before. You've seen before. We'll clean them up. And these will not be going back on the car.
All right, so I was just doing some wire wheeling and some grinding, trying to get this stuff prepared for welding on reinforcements. That's gonna look something like that. And then where these creases are, it will fold down over the edges. And then trying to grind, just a little too intricate to reach a grinder inside that cup. And then even some of the intricacies in the weld here. So I'm gonna have these media blasted instead. Same with this one. Obviously I would have to do that ahead of powder coating with all the rust that is present. But going to do that ahead of time before welding, just to make sure we have clean and clear metal, because this is just a little too tedious. And I'm gonna work smarter instead of harder with a little money and get this done right.
So this section will move a little bit quicker than you might expect in a video, but pay attention to before and afters here, before and after. This is after media blasting out of powder coaters and with a copper weld spray put on. That's the bronze stuff you're seeing. And what that does is any area that has a piece of metal welded over it, you can weld through this stuff, but it also protects the stuff that can't be painted or coated afterwards because you can't see it. You can imagine a garage that's looking like this. This dude knows how to do some hunky ass welds. So Jeep Master Jake here, also again from Untouchables Tinting, helped me with welding on these reinforcement plates. Should be nice and tough. And again, we're jumping right ahead to powder coat. And these things look great. That factory satin black finish, everything looking super fresh. I managed to save the heat shields after blasting. They look totally fine and fresh again, which was wild because they did seem pretty rusty. So freshly coated here, not paying extra for brand new parts like these upper control arms. And yeah, we took care of it. These things look great. And I'm super, super excited to get these things back in the car. So last up for this episode was the teardown of the S52 engine. And this thing having so many miles, it was really just a question of the condition of the internals and what we'd be able to reuse or not be able to reuse.
We got Mikey here doing work, loves the camera. He said he couldn't wait for me to turn it on. Oh, there goes Mikey.
So I brought my friend Mike Wetzel in to be what I call the foreman of the engine teardown and the engine rebuild. Big Volkswagen guy, big Scirocco guy, and one whose hands and mind I fully trust with an engine rebuild because he's done this stuff a lot. So what this section was in video and what we were talking about is admiring what seemed like a decent looking valve train for how high the mileage was. Though all we were looking at here were the lobes of the cam. It wasn't until we tore this thing apart, we took the ledges out, that we could see underneath the caps and on the cam itself was pretty bad scoring. And in that sense, these don't have bearings you can replace. It's just metal on metal. So when those are toast, they're toast. and we need to replace them. Next up was popping the head off, and interestingly enough, we had been told that this engine had never been opened before, and it could be stereotypical enough that the head does look a little bit more fresh than the bottom end, but that was a question. Regardless, the head gasket was leaking, the head had to come off, and the engine's out of the car, so why are we even arguing about this? So what we're looking at here is you can see a little bit of rubbing on the sides of the bore from the pistons, and when you get the pistons out we'll be able to see it a little bit better, but in theory what it was is the skirts had been a little bit warped on these pistons and were just rubbing up on the sides of the bore and the block. In the end, the important stuff like the crankshaft looked fine, and the block definitely looked fine for a nice little hone. So you can see here on the pistons the dark to light area on the skirts where it was rubbing up on the hone of the bore. Here in the bores of the block, you can see evidence in different coloration there where things were rubbing a little bit extra. Fortunately, nothing looked too deep, so it wasn't too worrisome on the engine block side of things with machining coming up regardless. It's just its age. Again, 284,000 mile S52. Expectations were not super high for perfection, and that's cool. It's all good. So next up for us here was breaking down the head a little bit more to take the valve terrain apart again and prep for machine work. So Mikey and I here are just popping out all of the springs and retainers, then en route to the machine shop. So here we have everything loaded up. We got valves that can hopefully be reconditioned, and we're going to get valve seals, we're going to get the head and block both machined, decked, and honed, new pistons to replace the old ones that'll get weighed, and rotating assembly fully balanced, crankshaft polished, so on and so forth. So as I assume you can tell, we have a few more episodes to come, so stay tuned.
Never checked this when I originally took it out, but look how tight my oil pump nut was. Not. Holy shit.
Turtle Wax, dedicated to the drive.